And welcome to lockdown lecture number 6. So tonight we're going to be talking about Piero della Francesca, and this lecture was originally given to Slade graduate painting students back in December of 2016. So without further ado, I'm just going to get my trusty assistant to pop up some images that I'm going to share with you. Fantastic. Okay, so Piero della Francesca was and still is an enigma to me. When visiting this painting, The Baptism of Christ, with a group of students in the National Gallery a few years ago, one student commented that it was the most extraordinarily balanced work they had ever seen. Nothing out of place, a perfect harmony of space and form. The work, made around 1440, felt highly contemporary, reveling in its arrangement of form and colour within space, rather than promoting the sentiment of narrative. However, the relevance of the problems Piero solves does not mean he is an artist who is particularly accessible. To date, this has been one of the most challenging lectures that I have put together. Piero della Francesca's work remains slightly out of reach. The quality that so many attempt to describe seems impossible to translate into words. One feels that to analyse and interpret the works is to somehow destroy and diminish Piero's achievements. His paintings should be looked upon and not explained away. Objects are present due to their force of form and should not only be justified by assigning anecdotal, symbolic, or scientific value to them. But this is not a lecture of silence, however fitting that it might be for an artist described as the painter of silence. There is much to say. I just hope the works remain unblemished by the words I use to describe them. Piero is an early Renaissance master, famed for his emotionally cool designs governed by the laws of mathematics. Forgotten for centuries, he made a dramatic return to favour after the writer Aldous Huxley sensationally declared his resurrection the best picture in his 1925 essay. Robert Longhi continued to build Piero's profile after publishing his extensive catalogue in 1927. Many other texts followed, ensuring Piero's place within art history and inspiring the Piero pilgrimage from his hometown of San Sepolcro to nearby Monteterci, Arezzo, and if you're really committed, Urbino and Rimini. Many of his great works reside outside national collections, and many major works have been destroyed. Raphael painted over Piero's frescoes in the Vatican in the early 16th century. Piero did not have a turtle named after him, so does not share the fame of the other Renaissance masters, Raphael, Michelangelo, Leonardo, and Donatello. But we are very lucky here in London to have 3 of his major works in the National Gallery's collection. The most famous is Piero's Baptism of Christ, painted sometime in the 1440s. Here we see Christ in the centre, baptized by John as 3 angels look on anxiously. A figure further back is dressing or undressing after or in preparation for their baptism, and 3 figures in religious dress converse as a 4th strides into the discussion. The Holy Spirit hovers above the bowl of water that trickles upon Christ, who stands in the river that snakes back towards Piero's depiction of his hometown, San Sepolcro. The largest form within the composition we at first do not see, the tree. Its concealment within the composition is what Tom Lubbock described as the skill of Piero. It's a walnut tree, a symbol of Christ's crucifixion and the tree that covered the Tiber Valley where San Sepolcro is located. But really, it is a form that surrogates architecture and holds the whole composition together. It mirrors John's form, including his outstretched hand, creating a second canopy above Christ that sandwiches the Holy Spirit. The white trunk, beautifully mirrored in grey by the tree behind, leads you up into the dark weight of its branches, which pushes the eye down through the line of activity from the dove, bowl, face, and hands of Christ in prayer, his feet submerged in water, evidenced by the delicate white lines that loop around his ankles and John's right foot, only really visible when in front of the painting itself. A triangle stretches back from its trunk to the trees behind. The trunk also dissects the square that combines with the circle to create the surface into a golden section rectangle. The semicircle that forms the top of the panel is completed as a circle within the painting, the Holy Spirit at its center. The circle is carried across by the edge of the head of the disrobing figure, the arm of St. John, the cloth of Christ, and the nose of the far left angel. The vertical interchanging of figure and tree punctuates the painting into sections, breaking up repetitions of form and enabling us to focus on each part at a time. The three angels are a work in themselves, connected through their mirrored feet in triangular poses and by the engagement of hands and turned heads. The combination of color is stunning and strikingly unusual. It describes a group of forms that would usually rely on the primaries to create an aesthetic unification, visible in the wheel of color constructed by Raphael in his St. Catherine from 1507. But Piero, unlike so many others, rarely relies on such obvious color combinations to create harmony. The soft pink gently moves across all figures, from the beautifully striped wing up to the floral headdress, down into the draped shawl and delicately repeated across the cheeks. Christ and St. John are two forms beautifully at odds in color and proximity to the surface of the panel. Christ face on, translucent and chalk white, and John in perfect profile, wearing a ragged ochre robe. Yet they slot together through the shapes their bodies create, forming a right angle triangle. The shrouded head of the disrobing figure continues the shape of the circle carried by the top of Christ's garment and the left arm of the Baptist. The bent body creates a frame against the lower part of John's body, which contains the figure in the back, the stripes of their garment reflected in the water. Piero's depiction of the action of undressing is the most emotionally tangible part of the painting. It captures a moment of exposure and vulnerability, igniting feelings of compassion through the universal recognition of such a reveal, which we may associate more with the beach or changing room rather than a baptism. The shape of the dove mimics the shape of the clouds in the sky, which is reflected in the water below, connecting the sky to the floor. The lower parts of the painting contain delicate, small plants which sprout from the banks of the river and appear similar in size to the trees in the landscape, uniting foreground and background through their organic form. The four larger trees perhaps give the greatest feeling of depth, forming a triangle which begins with the tree closest to us and then stretches back to those behind. All elements within the painting are organized with a stunning sophistication. Nothing is out of place. As 20th century painter Philip Guston observes, the forms don't collide, they don't bump into each other, they move easily through one another. To make a drawing from this work is a revelation. One feels satisfaction and achievement in replicating the orchestration of form and spaces between, which has been so masterfully prepared by the artist. So often, painting is primarily accessed through emotion. We find a connection through narrative, feeling, the energy of a mark, or the sensation of color. However, Piero does not usher our emotions into his design. We look through our senses without the influence of sentiment. Philip Guston describes how Piero is remote from other masters without their completeness of personality. He is without our familiar passions. He is like a visitor to earth, reflecting on distances, gravity, and positions of essential form. Piero's rediscovery in the first half of the 20th century was no accident. He was suddenly accessible within the context of modernism. His figures and architectural forms alternate with negative spaces that have as much plasticity and presence as positive forms, recalling Cézanne's instruction, colour equals form. That is to say, colour becomes interchangeable as form and space. Its appearance begins to exist outside of what it might represent, instead operating as an object itself. The dove has the same weight as the clouds, Christ the same properties of the tree, the striped reflections in the water as solid as the statuesque angels. The rise of modernism facilitated the viewer in appreciating Pierre's art as pure form, a quality recognized as an end in itself, and we would be foolish, but you would be foolish not to approach Pierre's art form from within the context of his own time. Piero first appears in history in 1439, when he is recorded as working with painter Domenico Veneziano in Florence. At the time, Florentine society was awash with scholars who studied both the teachings of the church and the rediscovered Greek and Latin texts on politics, mathematics, and mortality. This was the age of humanism, where the science of classical technology was adopted alongside religious teaching, separating the Renaissance from the Middle Ages. Humanist circles generated an interest in classical learning and encouraged the innovations of the individual. Newly acquired knowledge rapidly progressed the arts, enabling revelatory depictions of space within painting. With the help of architect Brunelleschi, the young Masaccio accurately recorded in paint three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface, using one-point perspective in his Holy Trinity, perfectly executed on the walls of the Santa Maria Novella in Florence in 1427. This work is a watershed moment for painting. Philip Tendy describes the Trinity as the very scaffolding on which the history of Renaissance painting was to be rebuilt. Figures are seen within a believable space, structured around a single system of design which one can imaginatively enter, dissolving the properties of the wall. Classical architecture became the setting of the holy encounter, and it had become improper to exclude it from the composition. Vasari writes that in Masaccio's now lost Annunciation, painted for St. Niccolo in Florence, there were a house and many columns, admirably painted in perspective, with the effect so managed that the colonnade gradually recedes from view in a manner which proves Masaccio's knowledge of perspective. A number of Italian Annunciations that survive and house the Virgin within architecture, even though there is no mention of this within the biblical narrative, a testament to Masaccio's fame and influence. Since his death in 1428, few Florentine painters had come close to his achievements. All were painting in the shadow of the young master, struck down by the plague in his late 20s. However, many continued Masaccio's legacy through the accurate depiction of architecture when accommodating religious narratives. Sorry, we have a muting problem. Just one moment.
I've lost the video.
Zoom, eh? Thank you to everyone else who is waiting patiently. Now we shall attempt to continue with the lecture once my technical assistant has done his thing. Okay. And action. Okay. All right. Where were we? Fra Angelico's Annunciation, seen here and painted on the walls of the convent and friary of San Marco around 1440, is beautifully silent, yet charged with intense communication. The Virgin receives the message that she will bear the Son of God with a seriousness and quiet dignity. Her internal acknowledgement of the unknowable gravity of the news seems tangible. The arches and column frame the two figures, as does the black line of metal supports above. The strange narrow doorway behind, off-center from the top of the arch above, leads us to a small grated window nestled in the top left corner of the doorway. The natural light floods in from the left, dividing the columns into two tones. The central column is so prominent that it seemingly obstructs the line of communication between the angel and Mary. The desire to depict classical architecture constructed using classical technique almost disrupts the holy message, but Fra Angelico's soft light, enchanting touch, and delicate color ensures this is a spiritual painting rather than a demonstration of humanist knowledge that describes the architecture of the contemporary world recast from antiquity. And just look at those wings. Oh. Frescoes also began to describe numerous passages from the Bible within one composition, unified by a consistent landscape, available for the faithful to be read like a comic book. And again, Masaccio was the forerunner in design and execution. The Tribute Money is one of a series of paintings recalling the life of St. Peter, located in the Brancacci Chapel in Florence. Work was begun in the 1420s by Masolino and Masaccio, and finally finished by Filippino Lippi in the 1480s. The Tribute Money is told in three parts within one image. The central scene is the tax collector demanding money. The next scene is to the left as Peter takes money out of the mouth of a fish as instructed by Christ. And the final scene is on the right as Peter pays the tax collector. The three passages of narrative are brilliantly divided by the exceptional organization of space and form. Peter's face on the far left is obscured by foreshortening, but we know it to be him by his deep orange robe, carefully removed to prevent it getting wet. The space below him is a wonderfully sparse moment of activity, accommodating only the shadows of the figures and a few pebbles. Masaccio's ability to allow space to contribute so much to his composition is testament to his ability as a painter. Like Piero, trees are used to describe preceding space, and the landscape is structured through a gradient of grays, illustrating one of the earliest examples of aerial perspective. The building on the far right is also one of the first depictions of architecture using one-point perspective, the vanishing lines of which converge upon Christ's head, ensuring he to be the central focus. The building frames the last scene, boldly described in the primaries, as Peter pays the tax collector. A plank of wood oddly crops up from below, directing our eye to the payment and up into the shape of the building above. The plank also creates another depth of field on or just beyond the surface of the wall and recalls a similar device used to explore space by Cézanne in his Avenue at Chantilly from 1888. A green vertical appears at the bottom of the painting against the path, disrupting the recession of space. The green shape traces the surface of the picture plane and reminds us of the properties of the two-dimensional canvas. The central scene is a congregation of uncertain glances as Christ is harassed to pay tax, and in response orders Peter to retrieve a coin from the fish's mouth, a request to which he seems, understandably, visibly baffled. The collection of heads express unprecedented variety as they form a line punctuated by space that is filled with thought and communication. The tax collector, clearly identified by his short robe, has his back to us and assumes a position similar to our own. His, and indeed all feet, are painted with a believable relationship to the ground. Gravity is depicted through the sensation of weight, unequally shared between the tax collector's relaxed and rigid leg in contrapposto pose, a stance he repeats as he receives the coin from Peter. He is also the only figure without a halo. Previously, halos were depicted parallel to the picture plane, but Masaccio, keen to use every opportunity to display his skill and knowledge, describes each individually in conjunction to the position within space that each disciple resides. The hands of the central three figures connect in pattern, almost creating two parallel lines. The hand of the disciple on the far left points down, establishing the boundary of the central narrative. The barren space to his left also invites the arrival of the figures from Masaccio's iconic expulsion of Adam and Eve from Eden, spat out through the garden gates and aggressively ushered away across the barren land by the armed angel. Eve's despairing groan is almost audible. Adam's shame amplified by concealing rather than revealing his features. Their visible pain and anguish is a groundbreaking step within representation. Subjects were previously depicted with much more restraint. On the opposite wall is a fresco by Masolino, who Masaccio originally assisted, depicting the temptation. When compared to Masaccio's painting, the expressionless faces and static poses illustrate the progressive nature of the expulsion. Masaccio's organization of narrative in relation to his application of perspective and depiction of architecture must have had a great influence on the young Piero, especially when considering his own interest in mathematics. Piero does not portray the tangible emotion Masaccio begins to depict, but he must have been inspired by his orchestration of form and space for the benefit of the narrative. After 3 years in Florence, Piero returned to San Sepolcro in 1442. He did not stray far from his hometown for the rest of his life, and there is no evidence he returned to Florence. But armed with its ideas and influences, Piero created his largest surviving masterpiece in the mid-1440s. The legend of the True Cross is painted on the walls of San Francisco in Arezzo. It is a complicated scheme, depicting a series of narratives associated with the wood upon which Christ was crucified, beginning with its origins in the time of Genesis through to 628 AD, when the cross was stolen by a Persian king and then retrieved by a Byzantine emperor. These passages do not appear in an accessible order that follows the narrative. Instead, the sequence of the story bounces about the walls. It seems Piero has organized these tiers into themes rather than feel harnessed to the chronology of the story. The back wall has saints at the top, amusing scenes of a more contemporary nature in the middle, and at the bottom, the Virgin and Emperor Constantine receiving divine instruction from angels. Both sides show two groups of figures within the landscape at the top. The middle depicts figures within architecture, and the bottom includes two battle scenes. Like Masaccio, Piero uses landscape and architecture to structure the narrative, allowing various passages of the story to be represented within one painting. All designs are constructed as if seen from eye level, making them difficult to access. The overall sensation within the space is that design and location do not easily collaborate, but if taken each painting on its own merit, there are some wonderful things at play. The story begins with the death of Adam, a scene of Piero's own invention, necessary because it provides a logical starting point to the rest of the story. On the right, Adam and Eve are some 900 years old. The effect of gravity on Eve's breasts, perhaps the most explicit portrayal of the passing of time. They reveal to their children that death, a new concept to them, is a consequence of the original sin. The central scene shows the burial of Adam and the magnificent tree which grew from his mouth after Seth planted a seed given to him by the archangel Michael, seen with Seth in the distance. The tree forms the cross upon which Christ is later crucified, an instrument for salvation from God, now necessary in death. Opposite is the final episode of the story, the Exhortation of the Cross, set in the early 7th century as Emperor of the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius returns the relic to Jerusalem after retrieving it in a battle from Khosrow II, last king of Persia. The extraordinary shaped hats that reappear across the scheme are probably inspired by members of the Greek Orthodox Church who were in Florence at the same time as Piero, attending talks with the Catholic Church to attempt a unified front in the face of Eastern invasion. However, Western military assistance was minimal, and Constantinople, the center of the Byzantine Empire, an early Christian church, fell to the Ottomans in 1453. The legend of the True Cross, as chosen subject matter, contains contemporary clout. With the impending and eventual loss of Constantinople, the Catholic Church was keen to unify its followers behind the stories of the Bible. The story recalls the miraculous events which identified the cross as the route to salvation, reminding the faithful of the importance of the Holy Land and its relics, defended and protected by great Roman leaders for centuries. The whole scheme is a bit overwhelming. One does not know where to begin. But an exposed testicle is quite a surprising thing to see within the altar of a church. Piero presumably includes it to allude to the shameful nature of the men's task as they have heaved the holy wood into a hole. Their effort manifests as a middle figure bites his bottom lip, and the figure above bites his top lip. Piero always keen to mirror and repeat within paint, whatever the context. The sensation of struggle when hauling weight is also carried into the neighbouring fresco, as men pull up a Jewish man from the well, tortured until he reveals the location of the buried cross. The Annunciation below displays Piero's exceptional understanding of architecture and his ability to recast its form in paint. Guston also observes that the painting is quartered, so obvious once pointed out, but not apparent when first viewed. Each quarter is a separate picture, a successful composition in its own right, that when combined creates a unity that subverts the eye from its own divisions. The middle right tier shows the Queen of Sheba, in prayer at recognizing the wood as having divine significance. In the scene to the right, she meets King Solomon. Like Masaccio, Piero expertly uses architecture to divide up the narrative into scenes that also work across the whole painting. Their great achievement was not the application of perspective, which anyone can do if able to follow instruction. It was their creation of compositions that accommodated the use of perspective, which was so inventive. In the opposite tier, the wood is dug up, by now in the shape of a cross. It is waved over a dead body, which rises to life, proving the relic as genuine. The shapes within this tier are stunning. The pediment, the divisions of architecture that sport these floaty yet weighty circles, sit parallel to the surface of the painting, in contrast to the foreshortened nature of the cross and surrounding buildings. The figure to the right, in the wonderfully shaped blue hat, sports a deliciously deep red robe, a stunning intensity of colour which fades as it is reached by light. To the far left, a dwarf stands rather jauntily. Hand on hip, the soft palette of his dress, a beautiful contrast to the intense warm hues of its neighbour. His hat is another opportunity seized by Piero as he adds a new shape to his already varied range of headgear. The lower right episode on the back wall shows the vision of Constantine, a rare nighttime depiction. The angel, high on the left, is abstracted by the position in space they occupy. The neighbouring battle shows Constantine's victory over Maxentius, as predicted by the angel if he marched under the sign of the cross. With outstretched arm, Constantine carries the cross as his knights follow, sandwiched between a vertical collection of legs and lances that recall the composition of Paolo Uccello's earlier work, The Battle of San Romano, from 1438, and in the National Gallery's collection. Like Piero, Uccello is an artist aroused by shape. Wonderful confrontations of form cover the canvas. The gold circles across the breast harnesses of the black and white horses converse with the roses and oranges behind, like lights in the dark foliage. Green circles of clovers repeat around the edge in complementary colour to the bizarrely pink ground, more light-up dance floor than battlefield. Stunning combinations of the primary colours are witnessed throughout. Within the depiction of the furthest right horse, pastel blue, yellow gold, pale red, mint green, and woven white beautifully collaborate to illustrate the tension of sword shaft, leg, stirrup strap, and girth. Niccolao de Tolentino, leader of the victorious Florentine army, is upon his white steed, wearing an elaborate cloth cap. He seems ill-equipped in battle, but well-equipped for the composition. His small baton points you to the plumes of the knight's helmet, which shares its space with the distant figures, spectrums of red, yellow, green, and blue. Information is simultaneously hugely detailed and beautifully sparse. Single blades of grass are seen against a blank pink ground, and minute chainmail is shown alongside the reduced rendering of the horse. This is a detail of the central figure of Nikolai on his horse. It is the orchestrated exchange of blank and inhabited space that makes this work such a feast for the eyes. Uccello presents us with a battle scene that is a masterful collision of shape and form rather than a bloody depiction of war. And his impressive arrangement diverts our attention from the unbalanced fact that this battle depicts a whole army against one knight on the far right. Uccello and Piero are much more interested in the interaction of form and colour rather than the bloody debate of battle. The impact of Uccello's conflict is shown only through the broken lances arranged in a deliberate manner to describe the recession of space, and a fallen knight, seemingly the only casualty of the battle. The body is shown foreshortened in reverse, the feet too small and the torso too big. Its inclusion an opportunity for Uccello to attempt to figure out perspective. This is the artist at their laboratory, figuring out problems upon canvas through process. Piero goes a bit further than Uccello when illustrating the bloody violence of conflict. But his description retains a remoteness which does not betray his preoccupation with form. The battle between Heraclius and Khosrow depicts the struggle to recover the cross from the last Persian king, seen on the far right, about to be executed. He has been removed from his now vacant throne, housed under a beautifully depicted canopy, and beside it sits the cross which he stole from Jerusalem, hungry for the power he believed it would give him. His face is the same as the one used to depict God in the neighbouring Annunciation, perhaps to give visual substance to the infidel's outrageous blasphemy. Or perhaps because Piero, like all artists, is resourceful and recycled design where necessary for the benefit of the composition rather than the narrative. The painting is a fantastic orchestration of forms as the victorious flags of Heracles are inflated on the left and the defeated banners of the infidels are torn and broken on the right. Underneath, a collection of heads are protected and revealed in battle. Among the details, a nose of beautiful proportion is in conversation with an oval of armour. Below, a sea of bodies armed with various weapons inflict one another with a range of injuries. On the extreme left is a decapitated head framed within the body which it once belonged. Swords are edged with blood, which repeats across the ground in intense red. But the action feels stilted and scripted, like a bad Cowboys and Indians films in the days before cinema advanced away from wooden punches and tomato ketchup blood. And yet, it's brilliant. Piero treats every form in the same way. A lance has the same personality as a horse, a man the same energy as the architecture, a knife in the neck, the same impact as a banner in the breeze. Like so many painters of the time, Piero is creating a scene of something he cannot see. It is unlikely multiple models posed for him in the studio, and no nearby battle was observed to acquire visual information, translated into paint. Like all great painters, he invents upon reality with a solution born out of curiosity. Piero is guided by a personal logic that develops and organizes forms in a way that isolates them from the world. Wonderful moments of drama-free conflict reoccur across the painting. The battle includes all elements the viewer can read, recognize, and expect from the story, but it is told in a fantastically unique way. Violence has never been portrayed like this. Piero shows us much more than we expect to see. In 1971, Philip Guston recalled a revealing anecdote whilst observing the painting with a group of students from the American Academy in Rome. He describes himself talking about the man stabbing the other man in the neck. When a student remarked, "Well, he looks so placid. You wouldn't look like that if you were stabbing somebody." Guston describes how this comment illustrates the remoteness so many of us have from art. He continues, "We have such a direct way of thinking that it's like a movie way of thinking. That is, if a man is killing another man, he's supposed to grimace. But in fact, here, One of the great things about it is that he's killing this other man as if he's picking a piece of grass in the earth or lifting up a button. I mean, the greatness of it is, it always gives me the feeling that that man will always do that, like it's an eternal man, eternally stabbing another man, a timeless stabbing. So he missed the point. He wanted him to look angry. Early Renaissance painting is caught between the traditional visual language of the Middle Ages and the technology of the Renaissance. Objects are painted with a clear heritage to Byzantine painting. They stand in for things and are a sign for what they depict. Objects do not possess a quality of sensation replicated from the close observation of life, but they do begin to exist within tangible spaces, causing a brilliant friction, or perhaps it's a harmony between the space, between the space and the objects it accommodates, because both are described and constructed using the same calculating language. The set is not dressed and prepared for the arrival of drama and emotion. The solid, stable, and static quality of inanimate objects and architecture is also used to describe human form. However, later Renaissance masters did begin to endow their figures with human thought and feeling, achieved through the close observation of life. An emotional connection to the work occurred from the recognition of experience captured in perceived light. This could be the touch of a fur trim, the fleeting nature of a shadow, the sound of a sigh, or the colour of light, sensations evident in the work of Van Eyck, Leonardo, and Dürer. Piero does not require the transcription of life to construct his compositions. He does not imitate what he sees, he is in the process of invention. He uses systems free from the fuel of emotion, leaving his forms untarnished by sentiment. Their success is based on their material strength. This presence of form creates a conflict between the fantastic and the real. The fantastical nature of the story seems so brilliantly juxtaposed with the physicality of the objects Piero paints. They seem very real in comparison to the fantasy they portray. This is most acute in The Resurrection, the work Aldous Huxley described as the best picture. The question of whether this statement is accurate or not is meaningless, but it is a tour de force, and when I saw it, it did get me excited. The painting is a confrontation of form. It takes you a few moments to recover from the hollow gaze of Christ, the intensity of the stare amplified by the closed eyes of the soldiers, there to watch the tomb to ensure that Christ's followers would not steal the body and claim it had risen as Christ predicted. Unusually for Piero, there is drama here. One almost wants to shout, "He's behind you!" as Christ eerily rises from the tomb, the sleeping soldiers oblivious below. The composition is a traditional one used by many artists of the past, including Ugolino de Nerio's 1325 predella in the National Gallery. And like all astute artists, Piero has improved on what has gone before. Oh, there's the doorbell. Christ is front on. The tomb runs parallel to the picture plane and creates a horizontal shape that is in solid harmony with the vertical rigidity of Christ. His erect form is repeated in the flagstaff and trees, again used to help describe space. The trees on the right are alive and lead to buildings. Those on the left are in decay, but lead to a higher path towards a mountain, the righteous route being the harder of the two. The contrasting sides are one of many opposing features: the crumpled soldiers and upright Christ, the two states of consciousness, awake and asleep. The structure is high and low, vertical and horizontal. The color is also in collaboration. Red and green repeat across the figures. The outside helmets of the soldiers, colored in each hue. Two mirror each other's poses, reclining in complementary blue and orange. Christ rises in a pink robe, which picks up on the red helmet and shields below, forming a triangle completed by the outer figures. Piero's use of color is like no other. It is unworldly, constructed in a pastel light that seems to have a thickness that hangs in the paintings. It preserves and encases his figures like an insect in amber. As Guston recognized, they are eternally consumed within their action. They are timeless. There is no before or after. The figures appear as if on stage, lit in a light that is absent from the landscape, a backdrop that hangs behind. The fan-like arrangement of the soldiers is superb. The hands of the figure, whose head is in line with Christ's foot, are heavy on his spear. His eyes are closed, but his mind appears alive behind the lids. The soldier to his left, his face painted at a supremely challenging angle, is often said to be that of Piero's. His head seems to awkwardly rest against the pole Christ grips, a wonderful device to connect the soldiers to the rising Saviour. The Madonna De Pato is another work that is immediately impressive. To attempt to say why seems to risk ruining the work, a concern raised at the beginning of this lecture, but I shall persist. Its simplicity is sublime. The Virgin is shown heavily pregnant, the parting of her dress alluding to the anticipated parting of her anatomy. Her unbalanced frame is beautifully offset by the symmetry of the angels, as the green and red hues alternate between them. Piero repeatedly uses red, green, and often blue in his compositions, but rarely includes yellow. The unbalancing of the spectrum creates an unusual palette that is so distinct from other painters who often construct works around the primaries. The trinity of forms in the Madonna Del Pato generate a quiet power that feels hypnotic. But unlike the engaging eyes of Christ in the resurrection, the Virgin's eyes are lowered, her focus elsewhere. Her gaze is juxtaposed by the outward eyes of the angels, assembled as a framing device that accentuates the tangible strength and dignity of the Virgin. Although Piero's figures are often contained within a visible line due to the transcription of drawing to plaster, and in the ascetic tradition of Byzantine painting, here the Virgin's face is sculpted by light. Piero is clearly trained in the contemporary practice of transcribing the effects of light upon surface, recalling the lesson of Van Eyck, later to be developed by Da Vinci and Dürer. Similar in colour and tone, the quilted lining of the tent behind, the Virgin's face is still beautifully distinct in texture as it radiates a soft, subtle glow. The Resurrection and Madonna del Pato are instantly accessible, perhaps because they are single paintings, isolated from other visual disruption. They are a feast for the eyes, experienced without the urge to understand or identify meaning. When I saw the Legend of the True Cross, I was not overwhelmed by its greatness. I was left thinking I had missed something, but I realized I was intimidated by the scale of visual information. How would I interpret what I saw? But such concerns divert the senses from consuming the work. Susan Sontag writes that the inclination to interpret indicates a dissatisfaction with the work, a wish to replace it with something else. The danger is to think that interpretation assigns meaning that was somehow not present before someone came along and interpreted it. Interpretation prepares art for the viewer. It packages it into something easily digestible, an easily digested anecdote or technical achievement that satisfies its status as an important thing one should look at and probably photograph. But a lot of the time, it does the work no favours because it misses what delights the eye and qualifies the work as masterpiece and replaces it with a relatable information easily told to a friend. One of the earliest theories of art is formed from the Greek idea of mimesis, that art was an imitation of reality, an idea illustrated by the myth Pygmalion, the story of a sculptor who created a statue so beautiful and lifelike that he fell in love with it. And so art is a thing it imitates. Guston's student was dissatisfied with the way Piero depicted a man stabbing another man, because in real life, you wouldn't look like that. Sontag argues that all Western approaches to art have continued to be constructed within the context of this theory of art as mimesis or representation. She believes form and content are separated in this defense of art that makes content essential and form accessory. An artist like Piero refuses to make the separation. Even though his work depicts specific biblical narratives, The content is the form. Art historians have countlessly tried to squeeze more content out of some of the works than is already there. A whole essay is dedicated to the baptism to discuss the possibility that Piero is depicting the effect of refraction for the first time in the water beyond Christ's feet. Another essay attempts to prophesize the relationship of the foreground figures in the Flagellation. It suggests the two older men are united in the grief of losing a son, represented by the youth between them, their pain aligned with the suffering of Christ. But how do these interpretations benefit the work? If we knew the content of their conversation, would the painting release greater satisfaction? Is it not more intriguing to witness three figures propped up in a conversation which none of them appear to receive? Surely our task is to cut back on content, to recover what is already there, rather than invent content to obscure what the artist has painted. Any thought theory should assist in our engagement with the image, rather than force the art object to illustrate an art historian's concept based on overzealous interpretation. As Sontag so rightly points out, the function of criticism should be to show how it is what it is, even that it is what it is, rather than to show what it means. The countless interpretations that this little painting, at 58 by 81 centimeters, has attracted all cancel each other out. The most emotionally unbelievable flagellation does take place behind, and a contemporary conversation is held in the foreground, both details secondary to Pierre's interest in mathematics. Like Masaccio, he places Christ at the center of his drafted geometry. Piero's application of mathematics not only divides up the picture plane, it also creates a structure so mathematically accurate it can be constructed in space to match the architecture depicted in the painting, including the patterns on the floor. Huxley describes the flagellation as an experiment in composition, but an experiment so strange and so startlingly successful that we do not regret the absence of dramatic significance and are entirely satisfied. This is a work that, like Pygmalion, could literally be brought to life. Its scientific accuracy enables architects to construct the exact space the action is set within. Yet it could not feel less like an imitation of life, which is some achievement. The architecture is injected with more life than the figures we know to be alive. Painting is a reality, or rather it creates its own reality. If we merely compare it to our perception of the world and refuse to take it on its own terms, we will gain little from our experience of art. Great painting does not depict what we think we know. It surprises and confuses us in its reinvention of the world and educates us in understanding our own vision. Huxley professed Piero to be in possession of a genuineness that always triumphs in the long run, and I think he is right. The success of the work is based upon the motive behind the process. The great Renaissance painters go beyond satisfying the devotional brief. They also seek an education. Artists who make works because they are curious to apply acquired knowledge or acquire knowledge through process produce works that retain a quality that lasts throughout the centuries. But to access Piero is to look, and he requires you to look without corrupted vision. Piero paints objects in a way that represents no more than they mean to represent, making it difficult for us to project our ideas onto them. We are moved not through an emotion of figure, but through an emotion of form. And as Guston concedes, trying to write about these things or articulate them in a verbal manner is as difficult as painting. Perhaps we should leave the works alone, to preserve their remote innocence, uncontaminated by theory. The trick is not to miss the meaning by inventing the meaning, and to instead take the work on its own merit. Piero is direct and transparent, a quality Susan Sontag describes as the highest, most liberating value in art. Transparency means experiencing the luminousness of the thing itself, of things being what they are. I couldn't agree more, so I have refrained from labouring any content upon the two remaining works that are in the National Gallery's collection. I wanted them to remain unblemished by the words I may have chosen for their analysis. Instead, they will soon again, I'm sure, be ready to be viewed without the corruption of thought, isolated from the act of looking upon them. And they are the Nativity, and Saint Michael. Thank you. The end.
Well done.